and complete. Oh. Both Gov and Op are complete, or we're still just waiting for a few more people.
Op is complete.
Okay. How about Gov? Gov, are you complete? Sorry, am I audible?
Hi, yes, you are audible, but I cannot see my kauban yet.
Okay.
I don't think so they're here yet.
All right. Okay. Um, let's just wait. We can add them in the Discord, and then we'll start introductions. Yeah.
My teammate is here. Actually, we're sharing the same device.
Oh, okay. So the entirety of your team is here. No more. Okay. All right. Okay. Since both teams are here, we can start now. Hi everyone. I'm Marianne. I'll be your chair for the round. Paneling with me in the order of tab, they can introduce themselves, starting off with Bianca.
Hi everyone, I'm Bianca. Congrats on reaching pre-semis and good luck.
Hi, I'm Jellyn Alindogan, one of the panelists. Good luck.
Hi, I'm Raph, one of the panel. Good luck.
Hi, I'm Saul from panel in this round. Good luck to all.
Okay, amazing. With all the panel introduced, just a few reminders. General equity rules. Please be respectful of everybody's voice, POI preferences, of everyone's pronouns, etc., etc. Please be mindful of your timers, and yeah. Just a disclaimer. I'll be timing you guys, so when it becomes obvious that you're above you're b- you're above 8 minutes already, we'll obviously cut you off. So with that, opening the house, calling up Prime Minister. You're here.
Hi everyone. Name's Nails. Pronoun she her. POI. I think I'd take any time so long as it's not on the one protected time. I'll be setting my timer real quick. Okay, done. So I'd like to clarify if I'm audible.
Yep, you're loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll be starting. Where's the timer? I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Gambling sounds nice. Bet my stakes and I might double my money. But the problem here becomes on how it's going to be on all aspects becomes accessible to many youngsters, especially not getting educated as to how exactly or the boundaries of gambling becomes. Let's talk about what exactly gambling is first and foremost. More often than not, it is a form of bet and risk, generally a probability games or form that can be seen in like everyday, for example, conversations like it's not just simple as I bet my money on that person, but it's more on how the forms of gambling generally becomes from casinos, online betting games, and even towards, for example, low-lying communities that can be seen in Sabong. So these are often that are, for example, forms of this gambling. And but let's talk about who actually are in the scope of this banning. The people who are going to be on like the law is going to be underdeveloped set in underdeveloped countries, primarily because of the systemic dysfunction, lack of opportunities, and lack of incentives, primarily on neglected margins. It's unfair for the op to set this debate towards, for example, setting it only towards first world country. Knowing this, that people, for example, who are opting, for example, to gamblings are generally far more people who are, for example, poor or in the, for example, desperations of money. But let's talk about what exactly is the current status quo as to why necessarily the banning becomes inevitable. There is a rise of accessibility towards gambling. The gambling epidemic, they say. This means to say that the rise of accessibility comes from or manifested from online bettings that is endorsed by many influencers online because of the rise of excessive social media usage, as well as, for example, influencers using this as a way to endorse, for example, their platforms. Means to say that there's already, for example, an inherent big influence of people towards like of influencer towards, for example, people to you, for example, go under this gambling. The problem here is that it became normalized because of the increased accessibility of gambling in any forms. Talking about people opting it, talking about how people easily can, for example, opt into it because you can just, for example, take your phone and you can bet your money on it. The problem here is that people opt into this in the first place because they are economically at disadvantage, or people, for example, on the ground that wants, for example, easy money. The reasons for people opting to gambling is a the lack of employment. They look for ways to get easy money without having, for example, to look for a job. But this also reflects, for example, the systemic disadvantage that they have in the society because of the systemic failures that they have. But second, in terms of having a dopamine, for example, like attraction, let's go take your POI.
If people are deep down in the game already, will they suddenly lose the urge to gamble if you ban it?
I think that the problem here is that one, you do not give a rehabilitation platform for these people because you think that they are not salvageable enough. But I think that the banning becomes a first step towards stopping the accessibility. Even if there are people, for example, who are deep down in this gambling, it doesn't mean that you don't have any responsibility to take care for it. And let's now talk about how does the banning look like before up entirely, for example, demonizes this law. It's not entirely criminalizing the poor or people, for example, or individuals that are opting to gambling, but it's more on cutting the increased or rampant accessibility of gambling in many forms that people can easily opt into. But second, it means that you're going to undergo towards a transition period. This transition period means to say that it's going to be slow and gradual, not entirely going to, for example, like magically happen. But thirdly, it means to say that when you're going to ban, there's going to be regulatory measures, which means to say that it may not be perfect, but banning becomes a first step to understand multiple layers, for example, of where does this gambling inherently come from, which means to say that there will be a recognition of the state to see gambling as a systemic problem. But second, it also leads to provision of employment and systemic adjustments towards, for example, like the systemic failure that they have in the first place as to why people opt into it. But lastly, let's talk about the PY that she mentioned in terms of rehabilitation. Number one, even if people, for example, are deep down in the gambling, it's still their responsibility. It's still, for example, like the state responsibility that we have to rehabilitate these people. But how do you exactly rehabilitate people who are deep down in gambling when it is still, for example, like accessible enough to return into? That's the problem, for example, when states fail to recognize or like states, for example, still, for example, allows complacency towards issues like this. Let's talk about then on why necessarily is it principally justified to ban it. Number one, it becomes a form of addiction on their way, talking about how people becomes deep down in it. The gambling exploits the desperation of the people who are economically disadvantaged or just people who are looking for fun, but towards marketing or telling the people the money that if you put your stakes in it, your money will double down. When people try it out of desperation or hopes of doubling their money, the sense of individual psychological like dopamine keeps them in trap. This means to say that it becomes like the more and more it's accessible online, it's not like it's still in there. It means to say that people can return to it back and back again, even if, for example, like they're deep down at it. So meaning to say that banning only becomes necessary because we want to block the rampant accessibility of gambling pushed towards the society, primarily because it's accessible, and hence why people, for example, cannot, for example, like opt out into it easily because you can go back to it easily. That's how addiction works. So this is why the banning becomes necessary, because the first step, for example, towards recognizing, for example, like the state incentive is for cutting the accessibility of people or where they can get their addiction from, or where can people, for example, get their like vulnerability from. The banning becomes like necessary because it's also mean to say that it leads to state accountability, because the banning means you push away the narrative from the people that people who opt into gambling are the ones that are at fault, meaning to say that you give them the benevolence of an idea that they can be salvaged at the end of the day. But second, why is it? Let's talk about the state incentive on us to necessarily why the state should look after this. It's in the state incentive to be accountable for the for the people, for the state, like in terms of keeping them in check, or people who are in the margin. But let's talk about state paternalism and how their responsibility. Your people are already ingoing, who are already poor, but you also allow them to be, for example, addicted, and for example, to be more poorer. So means to say that you don't necessarily, for example, care for the people if you just let it be, just because they cannot be saved. That's the problem that ops POIs tries to push you, that they cannot be saved. The problem with that is that it makes the state looks negligent towards these people, with all of those reasons, Gov.
Yeah.
Thank you for that fine speech, Prime Minister, calling on leader of opposition to open the
I'm
class.
sorry,
Here.
guys. Sorry.
Hello. Hi, I'm Heaven. Wait, I think someone is unmuted.
Do you think Fanny?
DM, you're still unmuted. Yeah, okay.
Alright, so hi, I'm Heaven. Use/him pronouns. POIs whenever. Speech in 3, 2, 1. Accessibility is precisely the reason why banning makes no sense. If everyone can already reach gambling, why would your first instinct be to make it harder for the state to understand what is happening? Because I'm very confused about the mechanism that Gov wants to push. That if gambling addiction is already a systemic problem, then the problem is the people who are already trapped in the system. It's not the label of whether gambling is legal or illegal. Do not believe the reactive model that you get coming from side government. At best, it does not cater to the people who are already deep down in the game. This is the POI that my teammate gave, which is very important in this debate. Because obviously, this debate is not whether about gambling causes harm. The real question here is whether banning gambling actually solves those harms better than regulating it. I want to note, coming from a very simple observation coming from OP, gambling is not a niche activity that only exists because the government allows it. I want to note that gambling has existed for centuries across almost every culture, whether it's through things like sabong, whether it's through things like online betting or peryahan. This form changes over time, but the behavior still remains the same because the demand already comes from the people themselves. And this is where I want to just notice, right? The important point here is that these motivations will not disappear because gambling becomes illegal. I.e., if you ban smoking now, people will still become addicted to things like nicotine. A law can prohibit the industry, but it cannot erase the demand that sustains it. This is the real question in this debate, right? It's not whether gambling causes harm, but whether the state has the capacity and the leverage to control it, because this is a policy motion. So if people continue gambling despite a ban, then this activity simply moves them into things like unlicensed platforms or through things like underground markets, which I'm going to prove later on. The counter policy coming from side opposition is very clear. We will heavily regulate gambling instead of banning it. How does the regulation look like, and why is it 10 times better than banning it? One, oftentimes when you regulate things, you make it a well-documented bureaucracy. You enact laws, you enact departments to ensure that you are able to mitigate and monitor these kinds of harms. I.e., you will require things like licensed operators. You will require things like documented transactions. You will be able to push for more laws to limit these kinds of things, and you will have stronger monitoring through things like money laundering, or even having simple things like consumer protection measures. The reason why this is 10 times better than banning it, because one, I want to know that if you ban gambling, it's not like people will just suddenly go kumbaya and that they will just suddenly stop being addicted. Like, no, right? Because you have to realize that people are deep down in the game already. This is literally what happened when Pogo was banned. When Pogo was banned in the Philippines, these transactions did not stop. They went into unlicensed operators, they went into underground markets, thereby the problem was not solved. Thereby, people are still being harmed even if you ban it, because people are already addicted. At least on our comparative, once gambling remains inside a legal framework, then the government will easily be able to identify the patterns of harms and benefits. You're now able to investigate this much more thoroughly compared to when you ban it, when if the ban happens, then you will no longer be able to investigate it because all of the activities and the transactions are going underground. This is the debate winning distinction, because regulation allows the state to manage this behavior, a behavior that already exists. A ban only changes where that behavior happens. You often push it into spaces where the government sees less and they know less, and they can only respond after the damage has already been done. Therefore, your case is purely reactive. POI. 3.
The debate would be very bad if we assume that people are irredeemable, because even with regulation, it means people won't listen to it by basis of addiction.
I don't think you get the point, right? I never said that people are irredeemable. My point here is that It's precisely because regardless of whether or not you can redeem them or not, it's to the point that they will still gamble anyway. So the problem is that on your side of the house, you don't really prove how banning necessarily capacitates these kind of individuals to suddenly become better people. At least on our side of the house, we're able to like do these kind of things better. I think that this is important because number one, when the state is capacitated to manage things like gambling in the very first place, then now you will be able to suddenly document these kind of things, right? Because this is the straightforward counter policy. It means that you have things like license that you will ensure that these kinds of things better. Because I first want to note that, as I said, none of these mechanisms will disappear because people stop gambling, right? Like for example, someone who has developed a gambling addiction will not suddenly lose that addiction just because the state voted for prohibition. The person will still seek gambling opportunities. The difference is that they will now rely on people who have no incentives to protect consumers because they are already breaking the law. I want to note that these people are deep down in the game already. They will do things like break the law just so they can have these kinds of things. The regulation simply works differently, right? Like because gambling remains visible, then intervention happens much easier. The state is not simply chasing criminals after the damage has occurred, it is continuously supervising the activity because the problem on side government is that enforcement becomes reactive. The first argument that I want to run is just to talk about how this is principally good because you give the government more resources to actually be able to improve people's lives. If we establish in this debate that gambling is already a permanent economic activity, the question is whether the state should completely abandon them. I want to note that government do not only regulate industries to reduce harm, they also regulate them because you get productive economic activity. Because I first want to note that the state still has an incentive to keep legitimate industries operating. This is why even during the pandemic, it's not like sabong was banned. There's literally e-sabong now. Every legal business creates economic activity through things like taxes and in tourism and whatnot. Gambling is one of these industries. Like for example, people just simply do not spend money inside these casinos, right? There's literally lots of gravitational economic activity that you get from these kind of things, which creates multiplier effects across the kind of economy. Because you have to realize that a casino is rarely just a casino. It's literally becomes part of an entertainment district, right? Because this is the problem inside government. If their problem is that there are little to no laws that are underdeveloped in developing countries, then the counter policy is that we will enact laws to ensure that to ensure that everyone will be safe. And because these activities are legal, it's very easy for the government to do things like tax them. It's very easy for the government to do things like require operators to contribute financially through things like auditing and regulatory fees. This will now become a stable source of public revenue, and even not just a public revenue, but a form of public monitoring without requiring new kinds of burdens to ordinary citizens. And this is important because more broadly, governments should just prefer converting unavoidable human behavior into productive economic activity rather than allowing that same activity to exist outside the formal economy when you ban it. So when the industry is visible, so the society is able to capture value from it. But when it is hidden, the value disappears from the public while the behavior itself often remains. And this is the problem with Gov. Their policy is that they want to rehabilitate people. I first want to note that there's not just 1 or 10 gamblers living in the Philippines. There's millions of people gambling in the Philippines. It's very unclear to me as to how they're able to cater to the scope of these millions of people, not just in the Philippines, but outside the Philippines when there's literally a ban. Because I want to note that the backlash and the shift of policy that happens inside government is something that they still don't prove. At the end of the day, they don't really cater to the people. At best, it's a reactive model.
Okay, thank you for that fine speech, Leader of Opposition, calling on Deputy Prime Minister. Here, here.
Hello. Okay, Hale told me to open cam, so I can. Raise your hand if you have a POI. My laptop is full volume. Aside from that, don't verbally raise it. Also, ano pa yun? What else am I gonna say? Actually, nothing else. Thanks. Pronouns, anything. I will be asking for POIs either ways, explicitly. If you can't raise a POI by the time that I ask, then don't expect for me to answer your point. Teka lang. Last minute rearranging. Okay. Timer 3, 2, 1. Go. Gambling earns money because customers lose. It is the only industry where investing more time, efforts, and learning these strategies remain unrewarded and is further punished. This very market profits fundamentally depend on predictable human loss and addiction. This positions the state legitimate duty to eliminate this industry as it's based on a predictable harm regardless on the amount of income generation that side opposition is able to discuss coming from leader of opposition. The first thing I'll extend is why gambling fundamentally cannot be regulated even with state intervention. One, the efficacy of state regulation relies on rationally non-vulnerable ordinary consumers. This means that enforcers of any regulation becomes less and less effective as you cooperate with each other internally because of the very structure that exists within gambling. Look at status quo. There are massive evasive measures that they perform already to hide these casino chains and evade these police individuals, but also because sometimes they also pay these police individuals as well. Also because the state cannot just place those reinforcers literally inside, like police people inside the gambling chains. Otherwise, it loses the unique structure of making this as a comfortable place to give these people some sort of fulfillment or what have you, and any other impacts that LO mentions. But B, because addicted individuals as a byproduct are not one of them, and they do not have the active incentive to push for inconsistencies and report these crimes. Because gambling being transactional in nature means that if one company dies out, so does the other people who opt into this, who likely cannot escape because of sunk cost fallacy, amongst other pernicious reasons that exist in status quo. The second simple reason is because there exists massive power asymmetry within these structures. Often, even these large gambling chains co-opt the narratives that help legitimize their stay. This looks like pogo hubs that are connected politically, and they try to borrow like Alice Guo by certain actors, like even political actors as well, or even certain artists that exist in the Philippines. The problem is that there always exists the political uncertainty anywhere in the world, because the nuanced framing from PM suggests that there needs massive capacity to fulfill this regulation. This means that at best, this can only be done well by first world superpower countries instead of these third world countries. What is the direct implication? This does nothing beneficial except the fact that it leads to power concentration, and societally speaking, this means that internationally, the policy on regulation is inherently oppressive to developing nations or nations with large amounts of poor people that are oftentimes victims of this. This means that it already creates an unhealthy form of competition that also results to behavioral changes and makes things much worse. I'll expand on that later. But the third simple reason is that online gambling and spaces are simply protected spaces, both for consumers and creators of this app, that gives them active mechanisms to evade these spaces, and it's hard to regulate it. This is because anonymity issues and other information makes it too hard to truly locate the problem and make these regulations specified in targeting healthy and unhealthy spaces, to which LO never proved to begin with. But fourth, because some of these large gambling companies are external entities that are simply harder and harder to interfere. This mixes on the third reason about online gambling operations, that these policies require cross-border operation. This is intuitively and massively harmful for the reason that it only enables regulation asymmetry internationally that allows bigger countries to subsume and capture themselves against other countries' laws. This means that a simple conclusion to this is the success of regulation is impossible to accrue with the increased likelihood of failure in vulnerable nations' on-side opposition. In the instance that they do succeed, it subsumes their model under ours, that it no longer becomes util even with income generation, because the access to this has become highly punitive to be accessed by the average citizen, therefore bringing down their other constructives as well. But also, this means that the state understands these structures already retrospectively. It's no longer about familiarizing yourself, it's about the success in the implementation. The second thing I want to discuss is about productivity and the flash out counterfactual on-site government. Their only call out as to why capacity-wise this cannot happen is for the reason that this would literally like displace a lot of individuals. They never engage on the very explicit mechanism coming from PM that this will not be done in an instant manner, and likely this will be done in specified places one by one. So I do not understand why that can call out can fly in this debate. I think, however, that it's much more highly dystopic to believe that individual reformation cannot happen. Both ends have to agree that it can. The margin lies on the active pressures as to what forms of industries are palatable to opt into. LO is massively wrong to imply that they are irredeemable before POI, which, by the way, thanks for saying they are, and that literally they would opt into harmful CFs such as crimes or black markets because of two structural reasons. But before proceeding, yes, point.
If addiction is your concern, why is your first intervention to ban and criminalize these instead of early regulation?
So I think we wouldn't necessarily be criminalizing these certain the people who opt into this, but rather the main companies. But secondly, because we've already discussed as how there are already regulations that happen, that's why we are able to know that it failed to begin with, that POI is a wash. These are the two structural reasons, going back to my speech. One, gambling literally is the very industry or market that enables these crimes and black market attitudes. The normalization of such an access is what precisely poisoned the people to opt into to not opt into corrective measures, but also because it also enabled darker actions, such as being more violent when you opt into sabong competitions, or how people simply just cuss out and in totality. But two, because the presence of gambling industries create a constant tension about rehabilitative measures. That's why we are able to observe in status quo about the futility of the actions of legitimate actors to convert or to correct these actions at the end of the day. What the banning does is simple in three folds. One, the information dissemination of other legitimate institutions, regardless if it has higher barrier to entry, permeates the mental calculus of these people, because it no longer has to compete towards other industries that is much more darker, to which even they themselves concede. So likely there's higher impetus for people to become much more productive at the end of the on-site government. But two, the banning, which maybe on the short run would utilize resources, yes, we admit that. The nuance on PM as to how this is not instant proves why on the long run, the state has to spend less in correcting these institutions and instead focus on creating better alternatives, to which LO kept mentioning. This looks like the rise of healthy green spaces, making them engage in social services and other actions to which they can reallocate certain efforts, such as giving direct incentives to people who don't opt into gambling habits or are already corrected in nature. But three, because you literally remove the very institution that enables this bad behavior, it means that the success in changing people is much more likely on government. Even if regulation happens, even with the premise of success on opposition, people will not change because that gambling industry still exists and still permeates their mental calculus. I'll engage in preemptively. Maybe autonomy is what makes people change by allowing it to know their own decisions are wrong. One, the autonomy that exists on opposition is a clear facade. Note the very unique structure that gambling provides. It creates a false hope that makes people think that their very bad conditions can still be redeemed by their own selves only. So this means that intuitively, one, this means that people demand less accountability or essentially more communal forms of actions and corrective measures, because it lessens the face value examination of the people about the gravity of the harm of the situation. So people would think that they do not need more regulation or more state intervention on side opposition. In contrast, coming from side government, if they do not have any other scapegoats to exist anymore, it means that they will directly call out these government institutions because they can no longer survive within within the instance at which it's banned. All of those reasons, no reason to side opposition.
Okay, thank you for the kind speech, Deputy Prime Minister, calling on Deputy Leader of Opposition here.
Hello? Am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, hold on. Let me just set it up. My name is Aki, pronoun here, POS at 5th. I'll be starting my speech. Hold on. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Heaven never tells you that people are irredeemable. Stop strawmanning his case. You ought to note that people are redeemable, but your mechanism makes it so much harder for them to rehabilitate. Note that you cannot solve a public dangerous crisis by first making the affected population disappear from public view. The problem of government is that they assume that when you ought to ban these things or when you ought to prohibit them, this already creates political attention. We'd ought to argue that when you ban these things already, you create things like political invisibility, for example. Note, government says that, the ban makes the state realize that addiction is systemic. First of all, I would like to ask, why would that exactly happen? Because we do agree with the frame coming from PM that most likely these things would occur in things like other developed countries, for example, but you still have to note that most likely they have other problems that are more proximate to them. Therefore, the only way to incentivize states into having action in the first place is to have things like visible crisis, for example. This means that these visible crises are able to generate things like media attention, for example, things like public complaints or like statistics, for example. Those are the things that produce enough traction to make the state incentivized to act in the very first place. Note that when government ought to ban gambling in the first place, sure, that's given the best case that sure that legal casinos do disappear, but things like licensed gambling also disappear. What that means is that even if it does get reported to the state that the participation immediately falls, or probably how the statistics show that there's probably lesser gambling ability, the public now believes that the problem is now solved. But that is not the case, right? Because when they like generally believe that the problem is now solved, even if it isn't,
Sure.
which also engages to Heaven's case about how these things will probably go underground, which until now, on 14 minutes of government still has no response, then obviously the media attention will decline. Most likely the political urgency to have these like things like rehabilitation, for example, will disappear because of the fact that these budgets will never move toward these newer issues. But most likely then, these rehabilitation programs that government keeps wanting to push is able to just like receive lesser investment because of the fact that government assumes that when you ban, then automatically there's attention, and automatically when there's attention, there's rehabilitation. But no, that statistics is inherently not true because of the fact that they don't really prove the on how this happens in the first place. At least on our side of the house, Heaven was able to prove that the mechanism is so much more intuitive because when you ban these things, there's probably lesser visibility on these things, which means that there's probably lesser attention, which means that there's probably lesser funding on having things like rehabilitation. I said fifth. Why is this more likely on opposition side of the house? Because I think that you have to note that governments naturally prioritize things like visible crime, for example, things like disastrous inflation, things that are already immediately measurable. But you have to note that things like illegal addiction is already hidden from the people in status quo. You're going to make it so much harder on government side of the house because you ought to note that people suffering underground are rarely organized politically or are like rarely even seen politically, which means that they rarely become visible enough to demand funding, which means that the government's incentives actually become weaker over time. What is the extension coming from opposition side of the house? It is just to prove where people are initially safer on. Because I think that you ought to note that desperate people do not stop making desperate decisions simply because something becomes illegal. This ties back already to Heaven's argument how no matter if you do ban things like nicotine, for example, these people are still going to like crave it, for example. But just because they crave it doesn't mean that Heaven is already intentionally saying that these people are irredeemable. Most likely that's not really the case, right? But I think that you ought to know that sure, let's go to the frame of government. When they say that most of the gamblers are probably not irrational like thrill seekers, they probably don't want enough like dopamine. These people probably gamble because they're poor. They probably gamble because of the fact that they face things like financial insecurity for something and experience addiction. These are true, but note that these are also motivations that still continue even after you ban them. Because I think that you ought to note the most vulnerable populations are people like addicts, for example, people that are low-income individuals, people that are financially desperate households, which means that they probably have the lowest capacity to simply quit or to simply opt out of these things just because you ban them. What is the mechanism then? On government, you probably are able to ban gambling, but you still have to note that addicted individuals will still seek gambling. Oh, but look, because of the fact that you did ban them, only the illegal markets will remain. Because let's concede, the state is probably not perfect, but when you ought to ban these things and it is no longer the state's problem, most likely bad actors are going to fill the gaps, which means that most likely these illegal operators, things like Pogo or things like that, will probably be the ones to fill those gaps in the first place because of the fact that they want to capitalize on people's disadvantages, which is inherently true, right? Because you ought to note that illegal operators have no things like consumer protections, for example. They have no betting limits. They literally have no identity checks, which means that the greatest harm that government keeps wanting to go away from, like for example, financial exploitation or things like that, or things like criminal involvement, are going to happen more so on their side of the house when it's no longer the state's problem to regulate these things in the first place. Just because you ban them does not immediately mean that they are going to go away. But sure, right? Let's look at the policy coming from government. They say that it's going to be gradual and they will do it from specific places, right? But I think that even if you do engage on this train, for example, it's still inherently bad because of the fact that because you see them, you cannot really have it visibility. Anyway, sure.
Do you seriously think that the tipping point is still about more traction and more noticeability when it's literally the most visible industry right now?
Look at the status quo, right? People literally don't gaff if you are addicted to scatter. People literally don't gaff if you look at that like Dola, for example, or things like that. We sure can see that there are probably things like influencers that are influencing these people to gamble. But because of the fact that they are accessible in the first place, which is inherently the case of Heaven, because of the fact that it is so accessible, there is so much more of a need to be able to regulate these things in the first place and not just specifically ban them, because of the fact that if it is easier to opt into these things, obviously people are going to find a way even if you do ban them. So I literally don't get the case coming from government. But let's look at the comparative, right? At least on our side of the house, someone that's able to experience addiction can probably have things like exclusion programs. They probably have things like they're able to interact with regulated businesses that are like casinos, like that are already partnered with the government, and they know that they're there. Because I think that the likelihood for rehabilitation is just much higher when it's visible and known as compared to government side of the house, wherein since there is no visibility, people are more susceptible to things like shame because of the fact that they're addicted to quote-unquote illegal vices. On government side, you have to note that the illegal operators are still going to maximize addiction because of the fact that these addicted customers still generate the greatest profits for them. So therefore, on government side of the house, there's no regulation that exists to stop them in the first place. Which the response, right? Because because they say that people cannot lose money if gambling disappears. But I think that only if gambling actually disappears, right? Our comparative is so much better and round winning because of the fact that the highest risk gamblers are precisely the least likely to obey the prohibition in the first place. What is the metrics you ought to weigh this debate? Number one is just on where is it that there's just much more regulation in the first place. But lastly, where is it the reversibility? Because as Heaven explains, the case coming from opposition is just purely reactive, right? Once gambling becomes underground and you have no way to regulate this, then obviously rebuilding the oversight that you have for these things is extremely difficult. As compared to our side of the house, when you're able to regulate it more, then laws can always become stricter if the harms increase. For all these reasons, you ought to side with opposition. Thanks.
Thank you for that fine speech, Deputy Leader of Opposition, calling on government whip. You're here.
Hi, government whip is on comfort room, so give us graces. Thank you.
Hi, just to avoid any further delays, is GovWeb ready?
Hello, I'm so sorry that took a
Yeah,
while.
amazing.
I had to run. Anyways, hi everyone. I'm very sorry for that delay. Names Latte. Let's say you always just like what do you say? Raise your hand, preferably around the fifth. Let me just like set up some things. Pronounce he him doesn't really matter. Okay. Starting in wait, Niels, how do you put on this?
You mean?
I wait and okay. Starting my speech in three, two, one. My dad is an online gambling addict. It was never good for us. We constantly told him to stop. He says he will, but it never ends. What happened is that we ended up plummeting in despairing amounts of debt on a monthly basis to the point where even his own personal paycheck or minimum wage does not suffice to keep up. This often led to him and my mom to fight a lot. As their son, I missed a lot of opportunities both in academia and in my extracurriculars because of financial restraints. I only got to debate here thanks to Ate Hale's generosity to offer us a free slot and team with slot, for example. If LO calls us out for a reactive policy, then best run that fucking policy because it kills families from famine before they could even see their children grow into productive individuals that contribute to the society because they die of irreversible health complications that they can never address in the long run. For example, what the story of my life paints is simple. Although it is a case specific context, this applies majorly to the poor families that exist within the slums of Tondo or even in Mindanao, for example example, a lot of underprivileged communities suffer from these realities. And even worse, these families, unlike my dad, often do not have existing jobs to bolster their crisis when that's piled up. Imagine how much more suffering this entails for them in the get-go. But sure, we need to be extremely charitable and engage with every single best case that exists from opposition because they just assert them. The explanation from Nails then is that it often results from a precondition or preconception that gambling is their only way to salvation from the slums. It is something that still stands and applies within the debate. This clearly explains the cognitive function of these victims falling prey into the institution that cyclically traps them into passive methods of trying to alleviate themselves. This is why rehabilitation is something that's far better. But second, note that gambling is incredibly situational at best. It's something that's uncertain. There's no guarantee that you always win. And even if you win millions, which might be as well just be the best case you get from opposition, it is something that's not marginal to the vast majority of people that are within the poor communities that are actively subscribing within these sort of institutions, as opposition correctly points out, that there are a vast majority of people who opts into like gambling, for example. It's not reformational at best. The system is inherently selective with those who succeed, but also punitive to those who lose in the game of gambling. This inherent nature of how gambling works is something that is incredibly disproportionate to the agency of these individuals to control their life, to already like look for something that could alleviate their situation far more actively and far more productively, far more meaningfully, for example, already clearly outweighs the principle on an ethical practice of gaining capital because it is simply never fair for the people. Looking at this in the lens of the state, for example, this directly engages with the best frame coming in the counter policy from opposition, that they say that you license these institutions and tax them and so on, so you get better regulation. Even biting this best case, for example, the sole idea that it is inherently something that relies on luck is something that continuously is going to be exhaustive in nature. You get to pour and more resources to be able to fully sustain these like programs, for example, or towards the individuals, for example. But furthermore, it's something that's going to be far more costly in a sense that you get to have more competition. You have to have more licensing towards other institutions, for example. It's something that's incredibly going to be marginally harder for you to sustain in the long run. And this is us engaging within their best case of licensing these sort of gambling institutions, for example. What this chunk of analysis does is simple, that it weighs on the model of LO. It kills their model in the first place because notice that regardless of the state's capacity to be able to regulate, biting their best case, they cannot guarantee equal standing and situation towards the far majority within status quo. It does not alleviate poverty. It's something that's selective success that has a success rate of me passing UPCAT, for example, that's something so low because I cannot access elite review centers. Do not believe this kind of argumentation. Regulation is never transformative. But second, notice that this is also independent of Stewie's responses, and that's me being charitable. What Stewie was able to destroy with an opposition model is simple. He cannot leave, it's simple, that he explains that taking the same incentive structures that opposition runs, people just cannot leave these systems because they are cognitively trapped. The amount of opportunity cost is something that can never be recuperated with a human time scale because again, its success rate is something based on an arbitrary metrics, e.g. the locus of control is placed on the idea of luck. What these all means is that the regulation is something that's impossible or rather improbable, but we explain further and flip that at least on our side, it gets far easier to push people to actively try and find far better alternatives. For example, you give them concrete incentives to go through more productive and active means of trying to alleviate themselves out of poverty. On scale, this is far better because you give more certainty towards people succeeding even if it's slow, because if they actively seek out for opportunities, they're more likely going to see those or meet those, for example. But even if they don't, because they're under the influence of copium or like the detachment thingy that happens when you're just when you just came out of an addiction, for example, at least the frame from Niels still stands that rehabilitation is something that's far better because you give them time to actualize and realize the degree of how much the harms of the state that they're in currently, for example, that you give them time to recuperate, that you give them a more meaningful life at the end of the day to be able to contribute to the society. Because the metrics often is something that's based on utility, for example, it's going to push them to be far more productive within society. society. Second, this is why Neil's materials are still standing and weighs more over the contention from LO. She explained that the system or institution of gambling inherently skews the responsibility of the state away and implies to put punitive action against the citizens themselves. This is clear from the
POI.
perspectives when we explain that the state now is unlikely to push for reformational policies that transforms the slums existing within status quo because they can easily scapegoat and say that, hey, at least these individuals have something more accessible. On government comparative, at least you push the state to be accountable to opening more job opportunities or like just bettering these conditions, which is simply bettering current existing social services. This directly responds to LO. The addiction comes from the lack of externalities of seeing another type of alternatives to exhaust their time far more meaningfully. This was clear from Stewie when he explained that with the ban, you're far more likely going to give more opportunities for these systems to be held accountable and change the system. This extends to the political case coming from Stewie when he explained that when you actively ban these advertisements, for example, because it extends from the case of DNO and this is me just actively engaging, absent these advertisements and licensed gambling institutions in media, you're far more likely to lower or break the stigma against the poor people because it was clear from Stewie that poor people are often seen as lazy and passive receptions of state intervention in terms of social services by forms of ayuda and whatnot. This means that absent this media manipulation, you're more likely to have individuals to call out the state even more, that because they now understand that these individuals are actually victims of their own government's political campaigns, you solidify the people more on the ground and of understanding and empathy towards these individuals, and you're more likely going to integrate them within society, which are actively going to productively help these individuals. It's far more sustaining in the long run. If you want sustainability, you ought to believe side government.
Okay, thank you for that fine speech, government whip, calling on opposition whip. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay. Name's Abby. If you add to the 5-minute mark, raise it your voice. I'll be taking one. Don't answer here. With all that being said, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. When people are deep down into the game, the solution is not to remove this. This is an invasive solution, and this is how psychology actually works. That stakeholders will obviously not interact with this positively. There's always going to be anger. There's always going to be negativity. The question is then, how do you actually capacitate the state and its people to create better change? Because understand that you cannot assume that when you remove this, the state will immediately be benevolent. That when people start calling them out, they're capacitated to actually change. Bad actors will obviously fill in the gaps that you create when you remove this, when you ban this. So the question is, how do you actually get this resources to actually create better change, especially when you try to push this development in third world country? Understand, you still need to have capital, you still need to have resources and actually create better funding or reforms. You still need to gain traction. That's why it's important to understand how gambling is a steady stream, especially in these kinds of things, right? Government is engaging in the sunk cost policy. They want to tell us that, oh, since people are already engaging in this and there's no money actually getting into rehabilitation choices, what happens is we pull it out and we have better changes because people are calling them out. You call out institutions, you call them for their lack of reforms, you call them out for their negative actions. But what happens actually is that you don't capacitize the state because they don't even have the capital at all to actually create this change. The comparative is an opposition. You actually have this capacity because what would happen is the resources coming from these gambling streams would actually be allocated into reforms, regulations, and licensures that's important, especially when heaven already tells you from the very get-go that this is something that cannot be reversed, but is much more easily reversible when you don't actually create this reactive reaction, right? What then are the clashes in this debate, and how do you actually weigh this? Number one is where the states are better off at. Government actually tell us that it's better off when you actually ban this because what happens is the state takes accountability on how they can actually create changes or how people actually answer the directions coming from these people who actually do this, not just the people in itself, but also the institution. They tell us that, oh, there's a transition period, there's a regulatory measure, and there's like slow, gradual changes on how to do this. But my question is, from all of their speeches, they don't mechanize how they're gonna do this, where their income is, how they're gonna where they're gonna take the money to how to do this, how they're actually gonna implement it. Because understand, we still have the fiat to actually impose this like regulation. This is already happening in status quo. Our problem now is how do we actually create it to amplify into better actions? How do we strictly regulate it? And I think from the very get-go, from heaven to Aki and to me, it's already well fleshed out compared to how their argument actually is. They tell us this form of addiction is something that is irreversible. Actually, this is coming from their side when they tell you like a real pragmatic example of how their families are going into debt, and it's hard to actually understand. 5 minute mark, please. How it's actually understand to reverse this, but we tell you that oh, these people are salvageable. It's actually easier to reverse this, especially when you have strict regulatory measures, especially when you don't make them underground, especially when you actually call them out to have safety mechanisms and checks and balances that until now they don't engage in how to actually like have those underground measures not prevail in their side of the house, right? What we tell you from the very get go is that, oh, we engage on your case that sure, this might be accessible, but because it's super accessible to other people, the counter policy then is to regulate this accessibility so that you actually have more bureaucracy on how to implement proper changes and also how people will actually act with this. We tell you that this is a permanent economic activity that will continue pervade regardless of the ban. That's why it's important to understand that the only way you can actually have solution is when it's visceral to the government and it's also proximate to the people. This is exactly how it's gonna go, right? What we tell you is that the counter policy is that with this stable source of income, you can actually allocate this into better regulation, and it's exactly how you call people out. Because understand that the comparative in government is that you call these governments out. So what's probably gonna happen is they're not gonna do it because Aki already beautifully explains to you that in third world countries, there's much more possible problems that people are actually much more willing to prioritize. In third world countries, there's such thing as poverty, corruption, and much more things to happen. That's why they're more likely to opt these resources into those kinds of things instead of allocating it into game is game. That's why it's important that the steady stream of income is something that they keep crucial because it's the only traction that they can actually push capital in terms of having like better mechanisms and better like checks and balances and regulatory measures to actually stop the prevalence of like bad actors in these kinds of situations. But sure, POI.
If regulation works, why do we still have black market gambling system existing as of status quo? But moreover, if you talk about state resource scarcity, even with all the taxation systems that you're talking about, why is this exactly productive and transformative?
I think it's transformative and productive because at least we have the reversibility of our action as compared to your side. Because you want to push that there's reversibility in your side because people don't have any means to gamble anymore. Oh, they'll stop becoming addicts. But again, there's so many forms of vices that you don't necessarily have to stop gambling in order for them to exacerbate this kinds of psychological actions or this kinds of psychological consequences. I think it's important to understand that, oh, even if you stop gambling, maybe they'll be a drug alcoholic, maybe they'll be a drug user, maybe they'll be an alcoholic, maybe they'll party and taft every day just to waste their money and find some sort of euphoria. That's why it's important to understand that this specific thing, especially when it gains traction, especially when it's a solid industry and has foundation, it's important to strengthen like the balances that actually creates better mechanisms within this, right? What then is the second clash and why do we win this better? Because it's exactly where the stakeholders at when we tell you that these vices can transform into something else. What happens then on our side of the house, and which is clear from like the very get go when heaven tells you that the state already has the capacity, that's why they need to exacerbate this capacity into something much more better, is that when you have this capacity, people, the state is obviously incentivized to actually create better changes. And I think you can see this especially when like how it happens like currently with a lot of things happening in like regulations of pagcor or like win Philippines. You cannot assume that these things aren't properly mechanized. They are properly mechanized. It's just up to the people. And I think that when you want to talk about rehabilitation, it is much more better on our side of the house because we actually have the resources, we actually have the means and financial capacity to actually enact rehabilitation centers instead of actually having those funding come from other prioritizations like education, or you pull them out from healthcare. This is much more bad in your side of the house. I think then what Aki beautifully explains to you is that the political urgency is actually the prerequisite to actually calling out these bad institutions that will fill in the gaps with bad actors, right? What then happens is when there's visibility about how bad this how bad this mechanism in like gambling sites is, or how gambling is in general, there's much more there's much more traction about how these motivations will actually prevail or how you can actually have safer mechanisms because when you have licensure, again, it's well documented. There's lesser money laundering that can happen. There's lesser things that exacerbate. There's lesser actors or even politicians that exacerbates this because what would happen is if it's very visible to the people, it's much more easier to call out, and when it's much more proximate to the state, it has better solutions. With all of that being said, proud to oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech, opposition whip. Calling on opposition reply, then op bench. Here, here.
Hello, heaven of reply. Speech in 3, 2, 1. Government wins if this debate is this House believes that gambling is bad. Unfortunately, this is not the debate. We agree with government that gambling can ruin families and that it can disproportionately hurt vulnerable communities. Their emotions and feelings are valid, and I sympathize with it. But this debate was never about that. This question was just about whether does banning gambling create a safer world, or does it simply make the same problems harder to see and harder to solve, and on this burden of wins. The biggest failure of government is that they confuse the harm existing with a ban solving harm. They tell us about poor families fighting because of gambling. We completely understand and we completely sympathize with those stories, but those examples are still outside the actual burden of this debate because they only prove that gambling can be harmful. They never prove why removing legal access creates better outcomes. Their entire rehabilitation mechanism collapses because rehabilitation requires visibility. You cannot rehabilitate people you cannot identify. You cannot intervene in behavior because the state no longer observes. This is literally what happened with Pogo victims when you literally don't know who they are. You cannot protect vulnerable people by pushing them into spaces where regulators and communities have less information. My DLO was able to specifically explain the missing mechanism that if people are already deeply trapped in gambling, banning the activity does not magically remove their desire to gamble. This is true because God literally talks about how they are engaged in a sunk cost fallacy, so it's also uncharitable for them to say that, oh, we will rehabilitate them. Again, you cannot have one way or the other. Either you rehabilitate them or either they're in a sunk cost fallacy. DPM talks about this, you cannot credit it to them. Instead, this demand gap will just be filled by things like bad actors, illegal platforms, and underground markets that have no responsibility to protect consumers. Gov never engages with this. They only said that people are desperate and vulnerable, but they never answered the question, how do you reach these people? Government repeatedly tells us that regulation will fail because companies will just evade rules and people will find ways around the restrictions. But this destroys their own model. If the state is too weak to regulate gambling while it is visible and legal, why should we believe that the same state becomes capable of eliminating gambling when it is hidden? We cannot simultaneously argue that industries are irrational, that operators are manipulative, illegal behavior is easy to access, and then assume that these same people disappear once gambling is banned. The law can change, human behavior does not. This is why our regulation model is superior. We are not pretending that gambling will disappear. We are simply creating a system where at least the state has enough capacity to have enough oversight and the ability to intervene. Let's weigh this kind of clashes. First, on incentives. Government loses their mechanism. They show us that the suffering of poor families, but opposition explains why their policy makes those families harder to find. A regulated system just creates pressure for the state to act because problems remain visible. As what Aki pointed out, there are things like statistics, there are things like complaints and identifiable victims. Governments have no incentive to improve because failure is measurable. Compared to their side of the house, where they will not improve because they have no statistics. Under a ban, government simply creates a facade of success. Statistics may show that there is less legal gambling, but that does not necessarily mean fewer gamblers. It may simply mean fewer visible gamblers. They reduce the evidence of the problem rather than solving the problem. Second issue, government says that regulation cannot perfectly solve gambling. This was never our claim. Obviously, we cannot have perfect things. It is just that on which world do you better manage unavoidable human behavior? I.e., we don't ban smoking because it kills people. I.e., we don't stop alcohol. We don't stop alcohol because there can be alcohol break because there can be alcoholic families out there. But even if regulation is imperfect, you give the state tools. This is why we don't ban medicine even if people can be addicted to it, because there are now monitors and there are now mechanisms in which you can mitigate and prevent those harms. So even if illegal markets exist under regulation, this may engaging with the POI of government to my op with, by the way, those markets are easier to combat when the majority of gambling activity is licensed. Government's world gives criminals the advantage by allowing them to operate where oversight is weakest. Let's be real, if we ban alcohol right now, then most likely there will still be alcohols. It's just that it will not be sold in the market anymore, so there are no numbers you can go through. Because you have to realize that as what Gov points out, they have multiple problems already. In status quo, they're already working on this. There are already incentives for the state to do this because it gives them funding. On side government, they only have a fantasy. They only have a fantasy that they never prove. For all of those things,
Okay, thank you for that strong reply. To end the debate, calling on Gov reply. Here.
Hi. Have flippers help me. It's not back to back. Wait, I'm positioning myself from the cam and now my mouse disconnected. Okay. Opposition, evaluating if it's bad is a prerequisite to justify whether banning is justified, but comparatively, Gov's discussion never ends on proving why it's simply bad. But because you're counterfactual, which is continuously making it enable, is what makes it worse because we've already proven why it is insufficient. But also, don't dictate our policy. You cannot assume that it's only a one-time, big-time thing. Zero monitoring. The timeline analysis coming from PM already destroys that call-out coming from op reply. Let's clarify the margin. Call-outs would happen on both ends. Corrective measures would still try their best to liberate addicted people. The difference then is whether or not they would try to listen to them. Time and time again, they don't. Not because regulatory institutions are worse, but because the very accessibility case from opposition makes it much more palatable for people to opt into it over these corrective institutions that exist in status quo. Opposition thought they win because they get accessibility. Really, an impact that is unpositioned is your tipping point with zero proper discussion whether increased use automatically means better usage. Damn, this is out rounds. The problem with side opposition is that they think until now, the state still has no data at all. Whoa, they assume that no efforts about regulation is happening and has happened retrospectively, which is simply false because that's already been happening in status quo, such as pogo crackdowns, but clearly there isn't any decrease to using gambling. But assumably, that's the tipping point. It is unintuitive why there's decreased attention on side government when literally LO, who considered that this will shift or change the lives of millions amounts of people, literally means that this would also aggravate these individuals and would demand probably better accountability measures, which is already explained as early as DPM. We agree, maybe there's less focus in the long run, which is the trade-off, but there's a sufficient amount of time already for us to properly transition because PM's model literally mitigates the sudden dispossession of these people's ways to cope at the end of the day. She already nuanced that on timeline, this is specified based on these certain areas who are already ready to transition and implement those other alternatives that they mentioned. This means as well that if the discussion is on alternatives, their counterfactual is not exclusive at all. On government, it can coincide with the process of banning, and that's the reason why a half-baked policy from opposition in a policy motion makes their team very vulnerable to losing. The margin is on the capacity for the state to sustain it. The difference is on opposition. The state has to continuously allocate fundings for regulation. On government, they simply have to invest lesser and lesser for only detection purposes in the long run. But also because DLO's discussion about less support when gambling disappears is so questionable. Gambling never invests in corrective measures. If I were an owner, I wouldn't be that stupid to give money to an industry that will defund me. But also because LO never framed that the regulation includes forcing these gambling industries to invest in vulnerable people. Check your notes, that never happened. Ultimately, the tipping point of opposition is still non-existent because the goal is still correction. The delta is you skip the unnecessary process of reinvestment from opposition and you receive it much earlier and streamlined on-side government. But even if the discussion is on correction, notice all of their corrective measures to changing the people is heavily assertive. The mechanism from DPM as to how you remove an industry that enables these destructive behaviors means that it's much more plausible to believe that people gravitate to healthier methods on-site government over opposition. No engagement even from the LO, by the way. But also because on positioning, the very beautiful although sad introduction from GovVip literally proves why this is not only punitive societally, but it further locks people to demand for better conditions, which literally makes DPM's argument about less focus to demand accountability fly higher than people who are currently in drugs. They say it's about changing the psyche of people by validating their ways to earn or simply financially generate income in the industry. One, this is very presumptive. They never engage on the behavioral changes that occur when you are inside in the very surrounding. So even if you successfully gain those new interventions on opposition, it just creates a deadlock on the interest of the people at best. But two, because validating their purposes literally includes making them realize that they can still enter and engage on other industries, that just because they are gambling right now doesn't mean they cannot opt into other alternatives. The validation happens better when there's no tension as to what proper action should they pursue. Enough charitability about ops burden push. What are the explicit pushes from side government that they never engage on? One, no engagements about the international impacting about subsuming vulnerable states to bigger superpower states. But two, that principally the instability remains justifiable and that the utility still lessens on greater extents in contrast to opposition. So all of the harms they mentioned still heavily minimized because of less opt-in that already happens on side government. So the explicit clarification is people are redeemable. The industry and its influence would never be redeemable and change. Proud to proceed to semis.